The Congressman has been a member of the U.S. Congress since 1989 and was recently elected chairman of the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and the Global Environment, a group that will have broad oversight and jurisdiction for U.S. foreign policy affecting a number of Asia-Pacific countries. His government service over the last 30 years included Lieutenant Governor of American Samoa from 1985 to 89, Deputy Attorney General of American Samoa from 81 to 84, Staff Counsel for the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs from 75 to 81, and Administrative Assistant to the American Samoa Delegate to Washington from 1973 to 75. He is a Vietnam veteran, having served in the U.S. Army from 1966 to 69, and was a captain in the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps during his service in the U.S. Army Reserve from 82 to 89. He received a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Brigham Young University, a JD from the University of Houston Law School, and an LLM from the University of California, Berkeley. He and his wife, Hananui, are the parents of 5 children and 3 grandchildren. He will be speaking today on Asia-Pacific security. Please join me in welcoming the Congressman.
I think perhaps understanding our modern day generation in terms of what has happened, what has transpired in our Oceania and the Pacific region. And one word that sticks out in my mind more than anything as a special tribute to our Hawaiian cousins, that people from all over the Pacific were united by some way or another, culturally, educationally, in this little village called Laie. And I would be remiss if I do not say it in a welcoming word to our Hawaiian cousins and to all of you, not the commercial way of saying the word aloha, but say it with real meaning. So at this time, I would like to say to all of you as my brothers and sisters, aloha. Aloha. It would be completely rude on my part, being a guest of one of the distinguished members of the congressional delegation representing Utah. Not only is he a brother and a friend to me, but he actually is the host because this is his district. And I'm going to depart from the text materials or whatever the agenda of our gathering this afternoon, but I really, as I'm sure you will be also honored, that I would like to ask my brother and colleague, a senior member of the U.S. House of Representatives, probably one of the experts in the House of Representatives on the issue of immigration, and I would like for him to, also a BYU alumni, to say a few words before I would give my remarks. My good friends, I'm really, really honored to introduce to you the Honorable Congressman Chris Cannon of Utah.
Eni was a little short on material today. That is not true. Many of you are laughing who know Eni very well and know that he's never short on material. That is very kind of you to introduce me, Eni. It is a pleasure to be here and actually to host my brother and colleague. Eni's office is, with one exception, the closest office to my office physically in the Rayburn building. We're right around the corner from each other and are close friends. And I'm honored to be here with Eni today. And I think I'm actually looking forward to learning. We pass in the halls, we talk, sometimes we ride together and walk together to vote and things, but I'm actually here to learn what he has to say, because if you consider where we're going in the world today, unfortunately, from my point of view, they changed the jurisdiction of his committee and took India out. But Eni and I actually co-chair a task force on India and work on that issue together. But India and, of course, China and the rest of Asia are very important. And, of course, China and India are the economies that are changing at the most rapid rate and have very different views about America, and they pose very different challenges to us. So Eni, who's been working on these issues for a very long time, is a master of these issues. I look forward to hearing from him and want to thank you all for coming out today And let me just tell you how honored I am to be called brother by a man like Eni Faleomavaega. Thank you.
Some of you may not be aware that Chris Cannon's great-grandfather was George Q. Cannon. George Q. Cannon was one of the early missionaries that served his mission in Hawaii, and by inspiration of the Lord had him met a native Hawaiian by the name of Napela, whom the days before was inspired to seek after this elder George Q. Cannon, and for the special work that they did, which was to translate the Book of Mormon into the Hawaiian language. Some of you may not be aware that the translation of the Book of Mormon in the Hawaiian language was the first translation ever made for the descendants of Father Lehi, was in the Hawaiian language in 1855. So Chris, really, as far as I'm concerned, he's a brother. He has an understanding and appreciation of what island people go through. And I just want to acknowledge that fact and the tremendous work that his family has done in bringing the gospel to our shores. I'm very happy to see another great native Hawaiian leader in our midst, a retired admiral, my good friend Julian Cow and his dear wife also with us. That's all right. I'm indeed honored to be given this opportunity to share with you some perspectives on the dynamics of the Asia-Pacific region and why it is of critical importance to the United States, not only in terms of international trade and economic development, but militarily and strategically important to us as well. Perhaps we can begin by citing the fact that almost 2/3 of the world's population reside in the Asia-Pacific region. Put it another way, of the 6.2 billion people now living in the world today, over 3.6 billion people reside in the Asia-Pacific region. The region also covers the world's largest surface area, stretching from as far west as Azerbaijan and as far south as New Zealand, and then as far east as Rapa Nui and back to Japan and China. Last year, our total exports in the Asia-Pacific region amounted to over $280 billion. But we imported from these countries approximately $650.2 billion. The combined imports alone from China and Japan total $435 billion. All these figures just from last year alone. I recall Senator Daniel Inouye from Hawaii made this observation by stating that for every 747 airliner that flies between the Atlantic and New York, 4 747s fly between the Asia-Pacific region and our West Coast. The involvement of the United States with the Asia-Pacific region has been one I would describe as one of mixed feelings. Since the time of Commodore Perry's initiative by opening up Japan's shores for commerce and trade, was not exactly one of open arms and one of willingness on the part of the Japanese desiring to know more about the West. Years later, after winning the Spanish-American War, our country expanded its own empire by acquiring the territories of Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico from Spain. If that was not enough, in 1899, without any authorization from the President or the Congress, a company of U.S. Marines stationed in Hawaii conducted a military takeover of the independent and sovereign nation of Hawaii from its monarch and ruler, Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani. Not wanting to shed blood among her people, she made repeated requests to Washington to restore her rule of her kingdom. Washington did not respond, and Hawaii was annexed as a territory of the United States. I guess in those days, one might say that colonialism was not such a bad word. So the British expanded its empire in the Americas, in Africa, in Asia, and the Pacific, while the French also followed suit by making claims in Africa and Indochina, the Spaniards and the Portuguese throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and the Dutch primarily in Indonesia and Papua New Guinea. I recall that even the Samoan Islands became embroiled in the competition for more territories by Germany, the British, and the United States. Situation became so tense that there were German, British, and U.S. warships moored along the harbor in Apia. All of a sudden, a hurricane struck the islands, destroyed all the warships, and the Samoans ended up having to save the sailors from drowning. That was our participation in that point in time in our history. My point is that it appears history has not been exactly kind to the peoples of the Asia-Pacific region. For example, at the time when India was a colony and part of the great British Empire, a young Indian, a graduate of Oxford University as a law student, purchased a first-class ticket to travel on a train in South Africa. He was told the first-class cabin was reserved only for white people, and so he had to move to where other colored people were sitting, which was the baggage area of the train. To make the long story short, he was beaten by the train officials and thrown out of the train. But from that experience of racism and bigotry, this young Indian lawyer named Mahatma Gandhi almost single-handedly shook the very foundation of the British colonial rule in India, whereby India eventually won its independence from Great Britain in 1948. Ironically, it was the teachings and the life of Mahatma Gandhi on the principles of nonviolence that greatly influenced another great American of our generation, an African-American Baptist minister by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I think I can safely say that Dr. King, more than any American in our time, literally transformed American society by giving greater meaning to the most fundamental principles of freedom and democracy as they are clearly stated in our national Constitution. In layman's terms, something like that the law truly is colorblind, and all who are citizens of this great nation are to be treated with respect and fairly under the law. I often quote portions of Dr. King's famous speech that he made on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on that summer afternoon in July of 1963, when he echoed these words that I believe were most profound and with deep meaning to all of us. Dr. King said, "I have a dream, and my dream is that one day my 4 little children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the contents of their character." Both Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. King were killed by an assassin's bullet. It is interesting to note that the world's most renowned scientist, Dr. Albert Einstein, said this as a tribute to Mahatma Gandhi, and I quote, "Generations to come will scarce believe that such a one as this ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth." End of the quote. Supposedly a heathen or a pagan according to Christian standards, but in my humble opinion, Mahatma Gandhi lived a life as close to the teachings of our Savior Jesus Christ as any human who ever lived on this earth. Our nation also did not have a positive experience in Vietnam. As a veteran of that terrible conflict, I was naive to believe what most of us took for granted on how the Western media had portrayed leaders like Ho Chi Minh as evil, as an evil man, and that because he was a communist, our policy was to make sure that his military forces would not take over South Vietnam. Years later, I found out that the French were the worst colonialists in the region, which included Vietnam. And at one time, even President Charles de Gaulle appealed to President Eisenhower to send U.S. troops to defend France's colonial rule over Vietnam, and also to destroy communism in Ho Chi Minh. And all that Ho Chi Minh was trying to do was to get rid of French colonial rule in Vietnam, which he did in 1954. I have often asked why so many leaders from the Asia-Pacific region became communists, or socialists, or Marxists in the 20s and the 60s. I believe it was because many of these countries throughout the region were colonized by Western European powers, and this provided somewhat of a contradictory notion in the minds of these Asian leaders. On the one hand, the Western nations would extol the virtues of freedom and democracy, And on the other hand, they ruled these countries as colonies and with an iron hand. Colonial history of our own country is something that we are all aware of. And I believe we have a deep sense of appreciation on why some 13 colonies felt strong enough to even cause a revolution by taking up arms to fight against, at that time, the most powerful nation in the world, the might of the British Empire. I recall some 19 years ago when I first came to Congress, I wanted to be a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, but I was told a member has to serve at least 2 or 3 terms before he can then qualify to be a member of the committee. I pleaded my case with the fact that there was hardly anyone, in fact none, an Asian Pacific American has ever been a member of this committee. So the House leadership thought about it, and this is how I got in. They needed a token Asian Pacific American to be a member of this committee. I'm happy to announce that after 19 years, we have another Asian Pacific American who has now joined the committee, Congressman David Wolfe from the great state of Oregon. But this is not all. 19 years ago, there was practically no interest among members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to serve on the Subcommittee on Asia-Pacific Affairs. The reason being was that the mentality in Washington at the time was that we were still fighting World War II in Europe. I don't know if you got the drift on that. Again, the mixed feelings in Washington. The Japanese attacked us on December 7, 1941. And 4 years later, President Truman made that fateful decision to drop the first atom bombs on other human beings in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And in August 1945, the Japanese immediately surrendered. And after establishing a constitutional monarchy and setting a free market system, Japan's economic standing in the world is second only to the United States. And then there is the Korean War in 1950, which we did not win, but ended up with a negotiated agreement that is still unsettled, especially when dealing with North Korea. In 1963, our country was confronted with another crisis, this time Vietnam. Vietnam became President Johnson's war. Our politicians and civilian authority believed that if Vietnam were to fall into communist hands, all of Asia would become communist. After 10 years of fighting, the draft was instituted. Some 500 American soldiers were sent to Vietnam. As a result of that, some 58,000 of our finest fighting men were killed in that terrible conflict, with some 200,000 severely wounded or maimed for life. And some 2 million Vietnamese men, women, and children were also killed in that terrible war. Today, Vietnam is still a communist country, but we now have official diplomatic relations with Vietnam. Last year alone, Vietnam exported to our country some $8.6 billion worth of products to the United States. As I said earlier, our nation's experience when dealing with the Asia-Pacific region has been somewhat of a mixed bag, good in some areas and bad in others. In a few days, I will be traveling to China to visit with the officials of that great nation. China is one of the 2 sleeping giants that are now actively engaged in international trade and commerce. The sheer numbers of the populations of China and India should be enough for anyone to consider now as major players on almost any issue that is global in nature. Our trade with China has risen from $5 billion in 1980 to $343 billion last year. China now is our second largest trading partner. For example, last year we exported to China about $55.2 billion, but we imported from China some $287.8 billion worth of products. China, as well as other nations of the Asia-Pacific region, now has a growing demand for energy with a population of more than 1.3 billion people to provide for. For this reason, China continues to provide humanitarian assistance to many countries, and she is now making investments in energy sources from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and even the South Pacific. I would say that only within the past couple of years that there has been greater interest by members of Congress towards the Asia-Pacific region. Just about every product that American consumers use no longer made in the USA. Our whole auto industry, for example, once the pride of our country's advancement in high technology and efficiency, is no longer a one-sided affair, whereby auto parts, for example, are made not just from the US, but from other countries of the world. Production, assembly lines, distribution systems are no longer just American know-how, but one that is truly global in nature. And this transitioning taking place is well described in Thomas Friedman's recent book, The World is Flat. I'm not making a pitch to get a royalty from him, but I recommend all of you should read that book, The World is Flat. The Asia-Pacific region is a dynamic region that will require our nation's best minds and future leaders to come forward and meet the challenges on how our nation should work together with the region that is so diverse in peoples, cultures, languages, traditions, and social values. And may I close with one of Rudyard Kipling's famous poems, which gave expression concerning Eastern and Western cultures. The poem is called The Ballad of East and West. I'm sure some of you may have heard of it. And I quote, "Oh, East is East, West is West, never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. But there's neither East nor West, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth." I believe this is the goal and mission of this great university, Brigham Young University, to bring the peoples and the cultures of East and West together, to build bridges and to open doors to opportunities that will foster greater trust and understanding for all of humanity, and above all, to break the chains of racism, bigotry, and hatred that so often limit man's own potential and understanding of his truly divine origin. Thank you. We are in now for a Q&A, I'm told. Is that okay? So shoot away. You might have some questions. I don't know if you had a copy of this that was just put out. It's entitled Faleomavaega Says U.S. Not Doing Enough for the Pacific Region. You might want to go through that, in my humble opinion. But yes, ma'am.
Current information on the situation in Tonga.
Could you please wait for the mic?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I just wondered if you had any information on the political unrest, the situation that was going on in Tonga, and how that is going to affect their relationship with Australia and New Zealand. We just hear so little here, and I just heard that Australia is now, their troops are there, and I just wondered if you knew anything about that.
Well, glad that you brought that up. I had just returned from Tonga a couple of weeks ago, and had a good meeting with His Majesty King George V, and also Prime Minister Saveli and members of his cabinet. Tonga is going through transition, there's no question. And the most unfortunate thing was the untimely death of Prince Tuipelehake that was appointed by the royal family as well as the Tongan Parliament to head this commission that was to do some kind of transitioning and eventually for Tonga to get into a constitutional type of a democracy, of course, with an understanding of where the royal family plays a role similar to the situation in Great Britain. They are still investigating the aftermath of the riot and the fire that was caused. Whoever was the instigator of the fire. The damages, the stores and the business that were destroyed as a result of the fire, I think amounted to about $200 million. But I'm not pessimistic. The Prime Minister is seeking support and assistance from other countries, and the several regional lending institutions, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, as well as from other countries as well. I'm pursuing some options and the possibilities also of seeing that if we have in our own country companies and investors who may be willing to participate in the rebuilding or reconstruction of this business district that was destroyed in Nuku'alofa. And we do have this program that's it's called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation that was mandated by Congress. This organization currently has about $6.2 billion worth of assets. And what this organization does is to encourage U.S. businesses to invest in foreign countries to promote economic development and to give jobs. And Tonga is qualifies as a recipient, and I'm making this appeal, as I've already done, to interested investors and business companies who may want to do this in giving assistance to Tonga. Sure. Well, good. Let's go home.
Can I ask you a question real quick? Is that okay? I'm just curious about what the U.S.'s position is regarding Indonesia and the relationship with West Papua, and then your opinion. Talk a little bit. It's kind of a loaded question.
Have you been to West Papua?
I haven't.
Oh.
I understand kind of what's going on, but.
Well, over the years, I have always expressed concern about the plight of the people of West Papua New Guinea. Just to kind of give you a little background, the whole island of Papua New Guinea was colonized by the Dutch, and all that is now Indonesia was also colonized by the Dutch. And so there was a lot of transitioning during the 60s, and at that time also we had the patriots, their names were Sukarno and Suharto, turned out to be the most brutal military regimes that the Indonesian people ever experienced. And so what happened was that they militarily took over West Papua New Guinea. And as a sad story is the fact that that was a trade-off that we had to make with these brutal leaders during the Cold War. So in exchange for Sukarno and Suharto being pro-Western, we just turned the other way and let West Papua fall into the hands of the Sukarno and Suharto regimes. And so what happened was that while Indonesia and West Papua were both colonies of the Dutch, I feel very strongly that two wrongs don't make a right. And the fact that being a former colony, you would think that the leaders of Indonesia would have a real deep sense of appreciation of what this colony of West Papua is going through. And of course, right now, I'm actively engaged in meeting with the leaders of Indonesia. West Papua, for your information, happens to have the largest copper and gold mining operations in the world. And it's an American mining company from Louisiana named Freeport. Only about a $55–60 billion enterprise that is going on there right now. And also the largest corporate donor to the Indonesian government. You can well imagine how difficult the situation is. And the fact that East Timor was given the right of self-determination because of Portugal's insistent efforts among regional organizations and the United Nations, East Timor was finally given that opportunity, and now East Timor is a sovereign country, also a former colony of Indonesia. And West Papua still is at this situation now that's really sad. I think, although we're told that about 100,000 West Papuans were murdered and tortured by the Indonesian military, actually it's up to 300,000 to 400,000. I don't know if you're familiar, the Papua New Guinea is split in half. The other half went to Australia, and which eventually became independent. But the western half was Papua, is still up in limbo. It's a real unfortunate situation in that area.
How many Indonesians actually live in that area? I'm just curious.
Well, when you say Indonesians, I guess you might say the Malay, the Javanese. During the Suharto reign, they literally had not a force, but migration of all the Indonesians were coming into the territorial areas belonging to the West Papuans, and I would say in the millions. Right now, there's probably a little over 1 million West Papuans living in West Papua right now. So situation is very tense. We've written letters and requests assistance also from this administration. Our policy towards West Papua is that it's an internal matter within the confines of the Indonesian government, and that our higher priority in our foreign policy in this country is we want to have Indonesia support us on this terrible war on terror. Forget democracy, forget freedoms, forget any aspirations about the right of these people to be given the right of self-determination. And this is where I have very strong disagreement with Secretary Condi Rice and the administration. These people deserve a little better than what we're giving them.
So what are some highlights that U.S. has done for the Pacific region, and what do you think we need to do enough?
I think if you read this little memo that I put out, you'll get a real sense that we have not done very much. We call it, or I call it, benign neglect. Just the fact that there's no presence whatsoever of USAID in the Pacific region just tells us what kind of a priority the United States has towards the Pacific region. As far as I'm concerned, it's almost zit. And that's a sad commentary of our country's foreign policy towards this region. And Chris and myself and other members were determined to make sure that there's be more attention. The East-West Center recently is trying to set up some kind of a conference to invite the heads of government from the Pacific Island nations to come to Washington, D.C. And my recommendation to these heads of government is don't come to Washington, D.C. if President Bush can't even find the time to even say hello to these leaders. It'll be an embarrassment, and I just don't think they don't deserve that kind of treatment. Now, some of you may have probably been aware of that President Chirac of France personally hosted all the island nation leaders in Paris. The Prime Minister of Japan, Koizumi, hosted these island nation leaders in Tokyo. The Premier of China also hosted these island leaders, I think it was in Fiji. And then just last week, I met with the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who was hosted by President Bush at the White House at dinner and the whole works. So there's a real insensitivity is what I call it. As far as I'm concerned, our U.S. foreign policy in the Pacific is only with Australia and New Zealand. All other countries are only incidental. And whatever New Zealand and Australia says, we just simply follow along. I hate to say that, but that's the way I call it. And I suppose somebody has a solution. The only problem here is that we have to press. It isn't just from this administration, even from past administrations. The other criticism that I have of our foreign policy over the years is it seems that we pay more attention only to the industrialized countries. And I guess our excuse is that we just don't have the time. We can only do so much, 24 hours a day. How can you expect us to meet with these little dinky little island countries? We've got more serious issues to deal in the Middle East and these big countries like China and India. But that's the attitude, unfortunately. I don't know if I answered your question, sir.
Talo fale tulo lava la paia o faciliatu for you as a matter perhaps a little more close to home. For those of us who love Samoa and watch the relationship between American Samoa and the independent island nation of Samoa, we constantly are baffled a bit by the difficulties that arise that should be facilitated with much more ease with the channel being only 85 miles between the island
40
nations.
miles. tip to tip 40 miles.
That's true. I'm talking from Piatapango, maybe 85, something like that. But we applaud your great efforts, and I give you tremendous credit for what you've done to establish an office in American Samoa, so that those people who need immigration help don't have to go all the way to New Zealand to get that. And I would like to have you comment on what you see as the possibility of that becoming a permanent facility to help our people move more freely back and forth and have the advantages of that embassy service so close to home.
Well, thank you. Just to let you know of how the bureaucracy sometimes constantly needs to be hit on the head in order for them to do anything. It took me almost 3 years to battle with Condi Rice's subordinates in trying to give assistance to the fact that Western Samoans have to go all the way to New Zealand just to get interviewed in order for them to get visas. And you're talking about almost $1,000 and $1,500 trip. And this caused, of course, tremendous hardships on families and for them to have a better way to travel to the United States. So now finally they've decided that Samoa would be the pilot program where we now have an agent or an official out of the consulate, our consulate office in New Zealand, to come and interview Western Samoans living both in Pago Pago as well as in Apia, and give them opportunity so they don't have to pay this airfare and all the things that comes with the expenses in trying to go to New Zealand alone. We found out that I try to explain to people this is a pilot program. We have a lot of kinks to get out of the system, and in a matter of weeks, I think there are over 1,000 applied for interviews, and it just wasn't made for that. So we're still working through and trying to have a better system provided for the needs of our Samoan people there.
Good afternoon, sir. My question falls directly on your plate, so I know as the last question, I'll make it profound so that you can answer profoundly, and then we can all head out of here. Recently, in a Honolulu Advertiser article I read, they spoke and articulated a point about the American Samoa soldier and his life, and also how much the recruitment part exceeds in Samoa as far as recruiting quotas go, and how they're viewed, I guess, within this administration. And I'm not going to say I'm, a Democrat or Republican or whatnot. I'm just saying, what would change the attitude of this administration as far as an American Samoa soldier's life goes? Thank you.
That is a very profound question, and I'm still trying to. For your information, American Samoa has the highest percentage per capita of casualties, soldiers who fought and died from Iraq in this war than any other state in the Union. Even though this soldier was recruited out of Hawaii, but we still claim him as one of our own. So, in effect, 11 soldiers whose roots are from Samoa have died in Iraq. Out of a population of almost 70,000 people, that puts us probably around 87 percentile in terms of the per capita kill. I think the state with the second highest is Vermont, with about 20 some percent. I mean, this is how high it is. And people have always asked me, why so many, why is there military such a big thing for the Samoan people? And I said, you need to get rid of this misperception and stereotyping that Polynesians are a bunch of lazy natives sitting under a coconut tree, strumming their ukuleles, and just happy-go-lucky people. They don't know anything about warfare or killing other people. The fact of the matter is, before the Europeans ever came, we were killing each other off in a worst way. I recall, I think it was Robert Louis Stevenson who complained about this barbaric act that the Samoans do. If you want to become the hero, you cut off the heads of the victims that you kill or slay. And Stevenson was complaining about this, so this paramount chief, Mataafa, came up to him, and he was carrying a Bible with him, and he said, hey, by the way, there's some kid named David went and killed this giant named Goliath, and then got a sword and chopped off Goliath's head, and we don't see anything saying here the Lord complaining about David doing this, so why are you complaining to us? You don't follow what I'm saying, do you? So much for barbarism. But I always say that the Polynesians were a very warrior-oriented society. Militaristic. They all loved to go to join gung-ho special forces, airborne 82nd, 101st. This is probably the nature of the Polynesians. If you want to see about warfare, you should study the Hawaiian history of warfare at the time of King Kamehameha. You talk about some bloody battles and wars that took place, not only there, but even among all the islands that were inhabited. So, to your question, why such a high number of Samoans or other Polynesians joining the military? It's because they love it. Secondly, as it would be true in other areas economically, opportunities are given to them to be in the military for training. And what's wrong with that? 20 years old, join the military. After 20 years service, at 40 years old, you retire. You have a pension. Uncle Sam provides for you on that. And that's the bottom line. I don't think it's the fault of this administration, sir, or any administration. And pretty good, I think pretty well we've come a long way. And I think now we have a generational term. I've got about 6 or 7 students in the military academies from American Samoa. They're all doing very well. The generational thing in terms that now they've become officers. Our Samoan Command Sergeant Major now is the highest enlisted man, Command Sergeant Major Savusa, who's now the Command Sergeant Major in all U.S. Army Europe in Germany. And that's a big recognition in terms of some of the abilities of our people to serve the military.